Bradley Benson. You're watching Tape with Rabbi Doug.
We're gonna see Rabbi Doug. We're gonna see Rabbi Doug. We're gonna see Rabbi Doug on your TV tonight.
But Daddy, I want to watch Monday Night Football.
Forget about Monday Night Football. There's no other thing we're gonna watch on Monday but Rabbi Doug. Yeah, Rabbi Doug on TV tonight. We're gonna see Rabbi Doug. Oh, everybody talk about that.
Shalom and welcome to Taped with Rabbi Doug. Glad you could be here today. My guest today is Emily Rose. Emily is the author of the book called Portraits of Our Past, Jews of the German Countryside. And I must tell you that Emily sent me this book about a week ago, and I have not been able to put it down in my spare time because it is so enthralling. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Emily, you are a native United States citizen, is that correct?
That's right.
Grew up in New York?
I grew up outside of New York, in the suburb of New York, but my family originally came to Chicago in the middle of the 19th century.
Really? You have lived all over the world in your studies, in your life, in your pursuit of writing this book. Can you tell us a little bit about where you've been, first of all?
Well, I had a very interesting background. After college, I traveled for 3 years in Europe, in India, and Afghanistan. And then I met my husband, and together we went to South America and lived in Peru for 9 years. And there I had a very interesting life. I was able to get involved with adult literacy, and also had a group of women who spun alpaca yarn and made products that I sold.
Really? How interesting, how interesting. And I have so many questions for you. I want to sort them in my mind because there's so much to ask about. First of all, the basis of your book is German Jewry in the 17 and 1800s, would you say, until today?
It really starts at the beginning of the 18th century and continues to about 1875, 1880. That was the period that I really researched.
Now, were you researching into your own family background, into your own family members, or into the places where your family lived and the type of lifestyle that they were accustomed to?
Well, we should start off by saying that I really didn't know anything about my family when I began this project. All I had was two old portraits that hung above the fireplace mantel in my grandparents' living room. And that's why it's called Portraits of Our Past. And then my husband wanted to learn German, so in 1994 we went to Germany. And just before then, an elderly cousin had given me copies of a handwritten Jewish family register. And on that register it had the names of my Berlesheimer ancestors and the name of the village of Murigen. So when my husband was studying German, I decided to rent a car and go down to find the village.
Which you talk about in the book.
Right. And so I really didn't have any project in mind. It was just a sort of a mindless yearning to find out what my past was like. So I went to the village and I immediately found out about my ancestors. And then the story broadened little by little to the extended family, to the village, and then the whole kingdom area.
Well, let me ask you this. Now, in your book, as you read through it, you have several photos of synagogues in the areas that your family lived, of graveyards and Jewish cemeteries with the Yiddish and the Hebrew on the gravestones. Were these destroyed and fixed up since World War II, or during all the pogroms when Jewish cemeteries, many of them, were desecrated? Were these restored? Tell me what condition and where these pictures came from.
Well, the pictures vary, and the situation varies actually from place to place. The one he's referring to is the cemetery in Murigen, which is along a very steep hillside, and it was out of sight and was not destroyed during the Holocaust. But some of the other village cemeteries, like the village in Michelbach an der Lucke, that cemetery was destroyed and has been set up again. And in Rottweil, it was basically untouched. But the synagogues, again, it varies. Murigen's was used, was obviously destroyed during Kristallnacht, and then was used as a munitions depot. And finally, it was torn down to make room for a school, and so there's a plaque. And the photographs and the engravings I have are from the 19th century.
I think that I have never read a book that is more enthralling, more captures your your interest, because you talk about expulsions from communities. You talk about pogroms in neighborhoods. You talk about the laws, the Israelite law, which you talk about throughout the book, that was set and the people lived by. It seems like it's almost fantasy, because we today, especially those of us who are born post-World War II, never really experienced the public anti-Semitism and the degradation of a people among other peoples that are living alongside them. Can you tell me a little bit on how you were able to gather all this evidence and all this history from 200 and 300 years ago?
I was surprised that all the information was still available, because I thought, like most people did, that all the documents would be gone because of the destruction of the Holocaust. But these places were just little villages and towns, and so were not bombed or destroyed. And the larger archives, they really kept these documents because they didn't separate out Jewish documents and Christian documents, so all the documents were moved to a safe place. In terms of my research, I really started out with looking about the lives of my family, and then it broadened out. And as it broadened out, then I came across the documents about really what happened to the Jews who lived in the countryside. And at times there were very hard times, and there were anti-Jewish statements and petitions and events. But I hesitate to use the word pogrom, because we tend to use the word more. There were incidents and events, and I would say the closest to a pogrom were the Hep riots of 1819, which I didn't know about before this project. And those basically started because there were very hard times after the Napoleonic Wars, and there was a depression, and the people did turn against the Jews, and there was destruction in the cities like Frankfurt and in the countryside. But the government did come to the protection of the Jews, basically because they didn't want the mobs to turn against the government. But in the end, the military did come out and quell the riots.
Now, you talk about the peddlers in the story, and I don't remember the exact specifics because I'm much further into the book now, but you talked about that, for example, they were protected by two things. They weren't allowed to be killed or raped and when they traveled from city to city in their sales. Were they often robbed and beaten? I'm not sure that I found the answers to those things as much as I did the things that they were protected from by the government in those times.
Well, we have to explain that there were various levels of economic stratum, just like they were for the Christians. There were the rich court Jews, who were very few in number, like the Rothschilds that we often read about. And then we had a small group that were basically traders and merchants. On the lower level, most of the Jews were peddlers. And below that were the Jews who really didn't have anything to peddle. They just went from house to house buying used old goods or whatever they could find. What happened was that after the Middle Ages, the lesser nobles decided that it was a good way to make money by allowing the Jews with enough assets to live in their communities. And these were called protected Jews. And these Jews were not allowed to be expelled as long as they paid their yearly protection money. But the group that you're speaking about didn't have enough assets, and so they technically were not allowed to live in a community. And so they could be expelled at the whim of the noble, and very often they were. And so when we say they had the basic protection rights, it's basically they could not be murdered and raped. So it was they had no rights above that. That is not to say that they were always treated like that. It's just that they had the insecurity that they didn't know how they would be treated.
Tell me what you found out about your individual family members, and a little bit how many generations from you were able to really research back into.
Well, one of my most fascinating ancestors was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Moses Katz, because he rose from peddler to trader to merchant to moneylender, and also was very important in the history of the town of Rottweil, which is one of the communities I write about. Of course, I didn't know about his history, but he actually saved the town from Napoleon when Napoleon's armies threatened to ransack the town, because he bought the silver and the gilt silver that was owned by the churches and guilds. And from that time on, they always wrote in the documents that Moses Katz served the country well.
when you mentioned his name, I remember reading the book and seeing his headstone, which you found. And tell me, where's the cemetery again?
This is in Rottweil. It's in southwest Germany, and it's a beautiful headstone. And he was a Cohen, so very. You can see the two hands and priestly, two fingers still left from the hands and the priestly benediction.
And just amazing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know anybody anywhere who have been able to research back that far and find actual relatives' headstones. Now, tell me about Moses Katz. Do you know of any other relatives that have the name Katz, as he did, pass down to this generation, relatives of yours?
The Kastan, actually, we did lose. That seemed to have petered out, but his daughters married the Rothschilds, but there's the Swabian, South German Rothschilds, and then I'm another descendant on another daughter's side of Gustl.
Amazing.
Yeah. But he was a very interesting person, and actually he did quite well, but then in the 1820s he went bankrupt. So he got caught by the hunger years that I was just referring to.
Before we went on the air, I asked you about the Shahar Jew, who was the below the peddler. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because you speak about that a lot in the book.
Right. I do, because it seemed to be part of the change of Jewish history. The Shahar Jews were the Jews below the peddlers who really just dealt in used goods and would go to farmhouse, buying and selling whatever they could find. And the cattle dealers, as we usually say that the Jews were cattle dealers, but actually many of them could not afford to own a cow, so they were basically like the go-betweens. And the word they used for that is schmoozer. The Shahar Jews didn't want to be Shahar Jews. They didn't. That's why I use that word specifically, because the translations in English are petty trader, small dealer, but it really doesn't communicate how desperate their situation was. They often would come back for Shabbat, and they would literally not have any money to contribute to their wives or to the family. But through the emancipation process, it was very interesting, a contrariness of terms, that the government, of course, the Christian government, acted like the Jews wanted to be in this trade, which, of course, they did not want to. So they would put penalties for them continuing this trade. But as soon as the Jews were allowed to go into the apprenticeship program, into the guild program, and were allowed to own land, everybody got out of the trade. And so within a few generations, it was gone.
Oh, so interesting. When we look at the different communities here, there were always a number of rabbis. You talk about the rabbis that came in and out of the community. The people voted on what rabbi they wanted. Almost today, like a synagogue board deciding whether they're hiring a rabbi to be the rabbi of their congregation, these were community rabbis. And these rabbis attended a number of different yeshivas, Jewish schools of study to receive their smicha, their ordination. And they were in and out of these communities. How did you find the research about all these? How did you find the information about all these rabbis and how they went from community to community? What was your research that you located all that information?
Well, the early information about the rabbis was from actually rabbinic articles that were written in the end of the 19th century. So they were actually recording the history of their communities. And then I found in the archives that the communities, because they had to have contracts, had these contracts in the archives for me still to find. Now, the contracts that I did find from the early part of the 19th century were in Hebrew and also German, written with Hebrew characters. So I had to have a professor at the University of Judaism translate for me. And they give a wonderful glimpse about what Jewish life was like, because they listed all the services that the rabbi performed and what everybody had to pay for each one of those services.
Now, were there, and I didn't find this in the book, but maybe, I haven't finished it yet, maybe near the end of the book, were there organizations, charitable organizations, that helped out these Shahar Jews and these poor rabbis that weren't making a living? Were there organizations that were helping keep them on their feet? Because you always find throughout history that the Jewish communities were helping out their poor.
Absolutely. I found that all the way through. They weren't really organizations per se until the end of the 19th century, but certainly I have the budgets from those early congregations and communities, really, that they were. And they definitely had funds for paying for the poor for the food and paying for the wood so they could heat the mikveh for the women. and providing food and wine on Passover. So all this was included. And a big part of the budgets of each community was to pay for the poor. And I should mention that the governments, the secular governments, for all the complaints they would make about the Jews, for whatever reason, they always said that the Jews always supported their poor, and they did.
Now, as your book has been published and spread out throughout the Jewish community and the secular community in its publishing, what have the reactions of the people who have read it, especially the scholars who have read it, who are familiar with German Jewish history, how have they reacted to what you've had to say?
I've been just overwhelmed with a positive response. But I found that people said this story hasn't been told before, and we appreciate you telling it. When I first started my research, I contacted archivists and historians in Germany, and also here in America. Anybody who had written an article, I tracked them down. And they basically said, when we write academic books, we can't spend the time writing about, as they call them, the people who lived in the countryside who weren't any historical import per se, but they said this is a story that really needs to be told. Obviously, people who, my cousins and friends and people I've met who had to leave Germany in the 1930s appreciate this because this is the story of their ancestors and of their lives. And then I'm finding a whole younger generation is really appreciating it because, again, the story hadn't been told.
Like I said, you almost can't put it down because you know that there's no way you could find out information like you talk about in the book,
right,
except from you.
Right.
And it's just amazing. Tell me about the Berlitz language schools and your connection to that and the founders.
Okay. When I started my research, I interviewed all my cousins, and a couple of them sort of mumbled, well, I think we might be related to the founder of the Berlitz School of Languages. And I tried to investigate that by talking to the school corporation, and they said, no, we believe that our founder was from Prussia, and his name was always Maximilian Berlitz. My book was published in Germany, translated from the English, and a few months after that, I received a letter from a historian in Freiburg, which is in South Germany, because he was writing an article about the Berlitz schools, and when he read my book, he said, I think the founder of the Berlitz School is one of your cousins. And I wrote back and I said, no, he's not, because of, the corporation said no. Anyway, in the anniversary book of the Berlitz School, they said his death certificate said that his birthday was April 14th, 1852. And I realized, of course, that was my David Berlesheimer, who I had lost track of when he came to America. So I found out that Mr. Berlitz was a Berlesheimer cousin.
How do you like that?
Yeah.
How do you like that? Tell me a little bit about the beginning of your journey into portraits of our past. I know the portraits are the real beginning. Do you have those portraits with you here?
I have pictures of them, obviously. Yes.
Pictures.
This is Joseph David Berlesheimer. He was born in 1761, and he peddled fabric throughout the Black Forest district all his life. He lived until his 90s. By the 1820s, he was the highest trade taxpayer in the village, and not surprisingly, at that time, he was elected president, Parnas of the community. And as part of that responsibility, he had to deal with the government. And that was the time when the Jews who did not have surnames were told they must take on surnames. And so Joseph David was involved with that. And I love that portraits with his stuff box.
Great. Let me ask you this about the portraits. They were passed down to you from your parents and from their parents and from their parents?
No, the story actually is involved with the Holocaust. What happened was that in 1936, Berthold Berlesheimer Levi, who's still with us, he's in his 90s, was looking for a sponsor for his parents and uncle, who were still in Murrigan. And he looked in the telephone book in New York City, because by that time my grandfather had moved there, and had shortened his name to Berlis. He went to my grandfather's apartment, and he said, my grandfather said, it's my wife's Marie's birthday. And Berthold responded that his mother's name was Marie, and it was also her birthday that day. So the special bond was forged, but at the same time, of course, my grandfather sponsored the emigration applications. And so when Julius left in May 1941, he brought the portraits with him and gave them to my grandfather to thank him for doing that.
And the second portrait?
The second portrait This is Moses Katz's daughter, Gustel, who married Joseph David Berlesheimer. And growing up, it was above the fireplace mantle, so we actually didn't see her eyes, but obviously, since I've been doing the research, I'm very aware of her eyes. And in an 1830s document, it was the contract of her son's marriage, the official wrote that she could not sign the document because her sight had been robbed. So she lived actually another 30 years being blind. But growing up, it's interesting what you remember. We always remember the luminous pearls around her neck. So I really wasn't, as a child, aware of her eyes. But that's part of the story as well.
How amazing. How amazing. And you still have these portraits in your home today?
The cousin, Bertol's son, has them in Connecticut.
Very nice. Very nice. It seems like it would take someone 50, 60, 70 years to do all this research. Obviously, it didn't take you that long. When did you really begin this project, and how did you proceed?
I began in 1994 just collecting documents, and then the first year I really couldn't read the old German script because I didn't read any German, but I recognized the words for Berlesheimer, Gundelfinger, and Katz because they had distinct loops in the old German script. And then, of course, every Jewish person had the word Jew before their name. Mm-hmm. And in many of the volumes or files, they were organized by the Jews separately. So that helped in that research. And then that first year, I brought these documents home, and I really, obviously, had no idea what was in them. My husband would speak to his non-Jewish tax clients who were German, and they volunteered to translate for me. And so they would spend hours with me. I would have the old documents and a tape recorder. And then as I input the information into the computer, I would follow it in the old German script, and little by little, I was able to read the old German script better. And then I also studied all the books that were available and wrote down citations. So each summer we would go back, and I literally spent 8 weeks the whole time in the various archives. I had my time organized that every waking moment I could be in an archive, and then each year I would bring back the documents and have them translated. And over the years I found over 2,600 documents, and some of them were just a line or a phrase, but some of them were many pages in the old German script, because when they wrote a petition, they wrote a long petition. And then I also used the Stuttgart State Library and also our interlibrary loan system for books and articles in German and in English. Mm-hmm. The big project.
Obviously, you spent a lot of time in Germany researching. How much time did you actually spend, and were these archives kept in the villages or in main cities? How much time did you spend in the cities that we're talking about here in the book, in the villages?
I spent quite a bit of time in those villages because the local archives were not terribly well organized, so you really had to go page by page through volumes or through piles of documents. So I would say that each summer I was there 8 weeks, I would spend, let's say, 3 weeks or 4 weeks in the villages and towns, and then the rest of the time in the state archives, still looking for documents from those places. But definitely I spent a lot of time in the villages and towns.
When did the actual Jewish communities in these villages cease to exist? Because I presume there are few, if any, Jews living in these villages today.
In the villages that I researched, there are no Jews living there now. Of course, there are Jewish communities living in the cities, but in these villages, there are no Jews anymore. They either emigrated or perished.
Before World War II, at World War II, or even before that?
The main, let's say, in terms of emigration, if the Jews were going to emigrate from these southwest German towns, they did it in the middle of the 19th century. After that time, the Jews were, in the 1870s, that were allowed to move to the cities. So there was really, the immigration to America basically came down to just a few people. So the communities as they were in the villages were really the people who stayed in the village to keep on with the family business. So after the 1870s, the Jewish communities in these small villages and towns became very small. Just basically a shadow of what it was like when they had all the synagogues and the Jewish schools. But still, in the 1930s, there were Jews who did live in these villages, and they emigrated if they could, and if they couldn't, they perished.
Was your mother's first language Yiddish, or was it English?
No, because it was my great-grandfather on the side who came in 1857. I have a postcard in the book of my grandfather writing in some sort of version of German to his father.
Now, it was your grandfather who sponsored...
Right.
And he was already here.
Oh, absolutely. His father came in 1857.
So he was the second generation American.
Right, he was second generation. And they never spoke Yiddish because what it is in South Germany, everybody spoke very distinct dialects that no one outside the area could understand. And then the Jews would add their little Hebrew expressions to them. But it was kind of trade talk. In other words, it wasn't really a Yiddish as we think of as Eastern European Yiddish.
Very interesting. What's your goal in writing the book outside of sharing the information? What do you think you want people to read the book and feel? What do you think will come of this research that you spent a lot of time on outside of maybe you might be maybe a bestseller someday? Everybody wants to be a bestseller when they write a book. So let's say you're not going to be a bestseller. What's the outcome of your book? What do you expect?
Well, I think I've been very pleased that it's been broader because this never was a genealogical study. It always was a history book. And my family is just telling the story. And this is a story that hasn't been told because we read so much about the Jews who lived in Eastern Europe or the Jews who lived in the big cities. And this is the story about the people who really had their roots in the German countryside. And it has two sides to it, as you were referring to, the experiences that the Jews had dealing in the Christian society, their difficulties, and how they achieved what they achieved, which is quite amazing in just a few short decades. On the other side, we often likely say, well, why did the German Jews stay in Germany after the rise of Hitler? And I think this book really explains that to a great extent as well, because we understand from reading this book how hard they had to work to become part of society and how they did feel part of the German society.
Amazing.
And of course, I'd love to have a movie and a video and actually a book for adolescents. I think this would be very interesting when people are learning about the Holocaust to learn about the lives before.
I agree 100%. As I said, I've never read anything like it, and it's so amazing. When you complete something like this, you can't stop and say, I've done my bit. What's your next project? You've got to be working on more. Your life has become research. So once a person begins research in their life, I think they research the rest of their lives.
Well, it does become addictive, doesn't it? I had started researching, and I'm continuing to research a side of the family. This is the book that's published was my mother's father's side. And the next book, hopefully, will be my mother's side. And it's a family who came from Posen in 1870. And it was 9 brothers who came to Chicago. And the name was Karpin. And in Prussia, actually, unlike the area of the southwest Germany, the Jews were allowed to be involved in trades and crafts. So they had been cabinet makers for generations. So they came to Chicago after the Great Fire and built up a upholstered furniture business. And it was 9 brothers, and it was in business, Karpin Brothers, from the 1870s until 1952.
Really? So many of our viewing audience may be very familiar with that.
Furniture.
Do you know where their warehouse, their factory was?
Oh, it was a huge factory on Cermak Road?
Cermak Road.
Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. Well, I can't tell you how interesting I have found reading your book and having you here today. The time goes by so fast and we haven't gotten to half the things I could have asked you. I just want to thank you, Emily Rose, for being on the show today. I want to thank you for sharing with us Portraits of Our Past, Jews of the German Countryside by Emily C. Rose. This book is something I would highly recommend for your reading, and I hope many of you will go out and take the time to take a look at this book. If you want any information from Emily or want to know more about her studies and her research, you certainly can feel free to email me at info@tvrabbi.com. And I will forward it on to Emily, and I know she will certainly get back to you.
Absolutely. I love hearing from everybody.
You're living in Florida right now.
I live in Florida.
And do you do most of your research from Florida?
No, I still have to go to where I'm doing, but actually the interlibrary loan helps me as well. But no, it's basically the documents from Europe still.
Great. Well, all the best and much success. Thank you again, Emily C. Rose, the author of Portraits of Our Past, Jews of the German Countryside, a most interesting book and a most interesting guest on our show. Thanks for being here on Taped with Rabbi Doug, and thank all of you for being here with us and joining us today. And remember, we're on every week at this time, so we hope to see you next week on Taped with Rabbi Doug. Shalom.
And I'm talking about Rabbi Doug. Talking about Rabbi Doug. Talking about Rabbi Doug on your TV show. Well, he's the rabbi for me. Anytime you need. You're gonna get married or you're gonna die. Gonna see Rabbi Doug. Gonna see Rabbi Doug. Gonna see Rabbi Doug. Gonna see Rabbi Doug on the TV tonight.